Okay, today we are continuing our study on World War One, and I hope you enjoyed those videos at the history bombs. And I would encourage you to watch them several times because they put so much information in those that sometimes we can miss some of what they're saying. But I really like that website, and if you want to look at any of the other things there, the activities, you can. Um, so today the question we're really looking at is, what does war look like? So what, and specifically this one, what does it look like? What are some things that we see happening during this time? And what, now, I also am going to say that the way it looks like in Europe and in other parts of the world is a little bit different than the way it looks like in the United States right now. Because at the beginning, when it first started, we talked about the spark and everything that fell and then everyone getting into war. So when that first happens, you mobilize your troops. What does that mean? That means that you need soldiers and you need to get them to where there's fighting. And so a lot of ways that countries choose to do that is through posters at the time, because there wasn't any television or anything like that. So they had posters, and these are called propaganda posters. Propaganda. Propaganda is a word used as if I'm trying to sell something, if I'm wanting you to believe something or do something based on your belief. So, propaganda posters were meant to make someone feel their job, their duty to their country, so that then they would act. So, you see, this poster here is very similar to what you're going to see in the United States with Uncle Sam. They have here their person, and I need to look up, I can't remember what they called theirs right now, but Britain's you. Join your army, your country's army. So the idea that you're needed. And um, this goes on into why soldiers would even want to fight. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But you would see posters like this. Turn your silver into bullets at the post office. So citizens were encouraged to use everything they had. All of a country's materials and efforts and money was going towards war. So whatever you had can help. And that's something that I don't think we really understand the idea of, that it wasn't just the soldiers that were sacrificing and giving up things, that it was the people staying at home that really had to figure out. They had this sense of importance that what they did with their money, with their resources, was helping the army. And part of that feeling came from these propaganda posters that were everywhere. So any silver that they had could be turned in so that the country was then taking that and making bullets out of it. Another thing was how you used food. And this says, don't waste bread, save 2 slices every day, and defeat the U-boat. One way to make people feel a sense of responsibility is to make them feel in danger and to build up the enemy. And a lot of the posters did that. So you are defeating the enemy. Look at this horrible enemy that we're fighting, and we want you to help us to do that. And so they even conserved their food. So why? Why would they conserve food? How would that help? You can't turn food into bullets. But where does the food need to go? To the soldiers. There's thousands and thousands of soldiers that are not at home, that are not at their places where they're working and getting money and getting food. So how are they getting food? The country is providing it for them. Well, where does that food come from? From money either you are giving to the government, from food you're providing. So there was lots of different ways for that people at home had to sacrifice in order that they were fighting this war. And I don't think we have really, our generations have not gone through something like that where we have had to sacrifice for a war that maybe necessarily we didn't see. But also in Europe, in this area, they actually, some of their towns were damaged and they would have experienced problems directly from the fighting. So even their lives would have changed in that way if their city was attacked. Um, so another one was women. The women of Britain say go, and this is really it's encouraging both women and men. It's encouraging the men that your women are supporting you and want you to go. This is also telling the women that it is your job to help your husband or your son feel like he can go and serve. So you are giving them permission. You are saying go because you are staying and you're supporting him in that. Because that is a big deal. Your husband leaves, you're at home, and then who's going to work? And also not just the idea of bringing money into your family, but who's going to work to fill those jobs that the soldiers were leaving. All of those soldiers that were going to fight had other jobs. And who was going to fill those? And we're going to talk about this later. The women stepped up and filled those jobs. And the last one says, lend your 5 shillings to your country and crush the Germans. So again, the idea of that you are helping defeat the enemy, and one way is you're giving your money. So one way that countries have used to get money for fighting a war, because fighting a war is expensive, is that the citizens will loan the government money. It's usually called a war bond. So I agree to buy this war bond for $5. So I give $5 to the government and now they can use my money. In exchange, they give me this sheet of paper that's a war bond that I can turn in after the war and get paid back. Okay, so the government the main idea is you loan us your money so that we can fight the war now, and then when everything's better, we'll pay you back. Okay, so this was not, we need to get out of the idea that wars was just soldiers. These wars, especially the ones fought overseas, especially for those people, it was everyone. And even here in the United States, the people, even though we did not see fighting here, the families left behind really did feel like they were sacrificing and working on behalf of the war. And it was a world mindset that we are all trying to give what we can so that we can win. But that we can win is coming from both sides, right? Okay, so what does soldier life look like? So I've got 2 soldiers here. This is what the British soldier would have looked like, more of his uniform. And this is a German soldier. I don't know if you can see it very well in this picture, but the German soldiers had this little kind of funny point to the tip of their hat. And that was a big difference in their helmets. And the British helmet kind of went all the way around, and the German just kind of had this visor with a point. Okay, so men leave their families and their jobs to fight for the country they love. Why? And there is a good video on the history bombs. The next video in the group that I showed you, I think it's 1.4, talks about why would men sign up to fight? Because if it's a war and people are shooting guns and I could get killed, why would I fight? Why? And I think most of us have such a strong sense of independence that we get to decide what we do and what we want to do, that I think we would just say, well, why would I go? I don't want to do that. I don't want to put myself in danger. But there is a sense, there are a lot of different things. And one of the things that you'll see in that video is, one is money. They paid the soldiers, and they promised to pay them even better than most of them were getting paid in factories. So if you imagine that of the time, a lot of the men were working in factories, dull jobs, not getting paid very much, not good conditions. Now all of a sudden, here's an opportunity for glory, but also for extra money. Hey, why not? One of it is pride of country. This is my country. I want to protect it. Those German Huns are coming in and trying to destroy us, and I'm going to protect what we hold dear, or your values. I'm going to protect our country's values, because if they take over, they're going to change us. So, and another one could just simply be adventure. I've never seen France. They're going to send me to France? Sure, it'll be a chance to see the world. There's a sense of adventure in some that cause them to join up in the military, or when there is war. For guilt, some people simply join because everybody else is, and if you are an able-bodied young man at the time, you were expected to sign up because your country needed you. So if you're walking around and you're not being a soldier, there's a sense of shame to that why aren't you? All your other boys that you graduated high school with are out there fighting, and why aren't you? So there was a sense of responsibility, but also kind of coupled with guilt and shame if you didn't, because your country needed you. That's your responsibility. That's what you should be doing. You shouldn't have the choice to just say, well, I don't want to. And I mentioned this a little bit, but for the future, I'm fighting for my children to have a better life. I'm fighting to make sure that they are protected. So for the future, that you don't want Germany to take, because this really was a battle over land and taking over, and these countries wanted to take over with force. So Germany was coming in, and if Germany took over, if you lost the war, you're in charge, basically, and you get to set the terms. And so if you want to make sure what you hold dear is protected, you will fight for that. Your side needs to win. Okay, so what did life look like as a soldier? Well, they left their homes. During World War I, it was trench warfare. So they dug these trenches all over the ground, and there are even some that are preserved now that I've seen some beautiful tours of some trenches left, and maybe you can look those up online. And so they dug these trenches and waded in the trench. Now think about it. You're digging into the ground. There's mud, there's dirt. The Germans reinforced theirs with concrete. British used a lot of wood. So what else is needed? You need people to chop down all that wood. You need people building planes. You need people building tanks. You need people building guns. So it's not just soldiers that are needed. You have all of this backup that's needed so that the soldiers can do their job. So they're sitting in these trenches. Now what happens? Imagine this. You've got the Germans are digging their trench over here. Okay, so they dig a trench and they're hiding out here. Here's the ground. Okay, so let's say this is the ground, and we're digging trenches, and I'm sitting down here waiting, and you're sitting over here. Nothing's happening up here, because this is where you can get in trouble. This is called the land between the trenches was called no man's land. Because guess what? If I'm in a trench and I stick my head up, what can happen? Well, you're going to get shot, right? So you're not just going to run over the trench and run through this land. So what happens if you're not going to just stick your head up and run across that land? What happens if we're all sitting on trenches? You could sit there for a long time, right? I'm not poking my head up. They're not poking their heads up. So you could potentially sit for a very long time, and then you have what you call a stalemate, where nobody's doing anything. Nobody can move, no ground can be taken, nothing can happen. And it's one of the things that the soldiers struggled with during this time is boredom. If you're not actively fighting, if you're waiting out and you're still getting sick and you're still not at home and you're still not with your family, it's hard. It's hard just waiting. Now, they did have some grenades and things like that, but you had to be in close enough proximity to the next trench to even do any damage, and most of them weren't that close. So there had to be an actual attack going on. Really difficult. So there was lots of waiting. You've got the mud, so they're sitting in the rain. You've got rats. Rats became a big problem and a carrier of disease during World War One. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but eventually the Spanish influenza in 1918 and people start to get sick. And they're in close quarters and everybody's getting sick and lots of people are dying. And so that becomes another aspect of the war that they're all dealing with. So trench warfare was very difficult. Now you can see, and I'm going to list this on another screen, on the next screen I think, there are tanks. And they do use tanks for the first time during this war, but they're not very effective. Because if you've got it, they're very slow, probably about 4 miles an hour. They're running along, okay? They can get closer to the enemy's trench, but they're just one tank. They can't do a lot, and they can't maneuver very well, and they would fall into the trenches because all of the land was dotted with all of these holes and digging and all that. The tanks would just fall in. They couldn't maneuver around them. So they weren't a whole lot effective or helpful in World War One, but they were there. Machine guns. This picture here is a machine gun. Look how big it is. They couldn't just kind of tote this around and carry it. They had to be, sometimes horses carried them, other animals, they put them on the backs of the animals and carried them. I should have put on here animals. Animals were used. Horses were still used greatly. There were more animals, I think. Check my sources, I think. But there were probably more animals killed in this war than humans. Lots of horses were killed because you've got generals still riding around on horses and they could be shot out from under them. You had dogs that were used as messengers, as just carrying goods around. You had carrier pigeons that were used. There was, I'll tell you about some of the famous things to come out, but there is a carrier pigeon that came out as a famous pigeon because of the messages that it wound up carrying during the war. So they used, one of the ways they fought was using animals. But machine guns were used, tanks. So we have this new kind of war. Gas. The discovery of the harmfulness of gas, especially mustard gas, was used a lot in World War One, and it could instantly kill you or very, very painfully blind you. There's all kinds of things, and it was devastating. It was awful. So you see here, this picture is one of the soldiers wearing this gas mask that was meant to kind of to protect them from those harmful gases. And you even see this horse with something covering its faces. They even invented some for the animals so that the animals would be protected from these harmful gases. And then planes. Think about it. The Wright brothers were just in 1903. We're only like 10 years later, and we're already using planes and trying to mass produce planes to be used for, they were used for spying. They were also used for attacking, and they fought in the air. Planes were doing combat fighting in the air. I read something from the National Park Service where that the government took over a lumber mill in, I think, Washington, and made it a wartime service because they needed so much wood to build the planes that they then put a whole bunch of soldiers there to work at the lumber mill and made it a military base. And all those men did was just cut down the trees and cut it so that it could be sent off and made into planes. So those are things that you don't necessarily think about. You think of the plane, but you don't think about how it got there. And so there are people that are having to sit in those factories and build those planes. And especially overseas, who is it? Women. Women. Lots of times were in the factories. They were the ones building the machine guns. They were the ones building the planes. Their husbands were all fighting. They had to keep things going. So, one thing that they did was the government created what's called a land army. And these women actually were like I think they were paid by the government, and they were sent to farms where the men were actually fighting. So the men couldn't work the farms, but the country needed the food to feed its people and to feed its soldiers. So these girls, a lot of them were college age, joined the land army, and they were sent to these farms and stayed at the farms and stayed in town and other places to work the farms for the men. And I love their name. They were called the Farmettes. Now remember, this is right around the time of suffragettes. Suffragettes were the women that were working to try to get women the ability to vote. So now we have the Farmettes. What are women proving? They are proving we are valuable, we are needed, we deserve to be able to put our vote in. If it's going to determine my life, and I'm going to have to farm and my husband's going to get sent away, don't I deserve to vote too? So they're really proving themselves during this time. Women were also allowed to join the military. Some of the first women to do that were during World War I, but they weren't sent to the front lines for fighting. A lot of them were nurses, and a lot were like what you call clerical positions, so kind of like a secretary. An army takes a lot to run. You don't just have the soldiers. You have the people making sure that the messages are carried. You've got making sure there were girls that were running the phone lines, making sure that the phone lines were working so that the generals could get the message to each other. You had lots of work needing to be done so that most of the manpower could be sent fighting. But there's more jobs to be done in a war than just the actual fighting. There's all kinds of things that have to be taken care of. So women, World War I is very important to women because they step up and in a big way are working in ways they have never been expected or needed to work before. Okay, so what about us right now? What about the U.S.? We're not in war, right? Right. But the world has changed, and Americans know that. I was reading something last night that said that the World War I really started the modern idea of philanthropy, which is giving money to organizations. And there were lots and lots and lots of people that were giving to organizations that were helping. And we had our posters over here too, even before we were involved in the war. This says hunger. For 3 years, America has fought starvation in Belgium. Will you eat less? Wheat, meat, fats and sugars that we may still send food in shiploads. Hoover, who was going to be president later, started a relief organization in Belgium because Belgium said, we're neutral, we're not taking sides. Well, Germany said, you're in our way. We need to get to France and you're in our way. So Germany comes through Belgium and attacks and takes over while they're planning their attack on France. And Belgium is basically just bowled over. And Germany is taking their food, they're taking all of their resources away and making them work for them. And so Hoover saw this and said, what can we do? We have got to do something. And none of the governments would step up because how are you going to get food to a country that's taken over by your enemy? If you feed them, the Germans will just take your food. So you'll be feeding the enemy. So how do you do that? So Hoover is a brilliant person because he worked with the different governments and he even created deals with Germany so that he could get the food to the Belgians. And he organized it in such an amazingly brilliant way that they were able to have food. He fed those people. People still today honor him. There are memorials for him for what he did because most people believe that if he had not started that organization and other people helped start and other people gave money to it, but they would have starved a whole country. It never in the history of the world had anyone organized a food program the way he did so that it would feed a nation of people. And he needed millions of dollars a month, just to give them the basics. And so he created contracts with governments and he sent these posters over to the United States and created a campaign for the Americans to feel a desire to give to them, and raised money for the country. I could talk a long time about this because it's pretty amazing what he did. So what can we do? Well, that was one thing. That organization was started. But guess what? Who needs supplies? Both sides. Who's not in war and can use all of their abilities to make all of the supplies needed? We are. We are. So guess what? America can make bullets and sell them. We can produce food and sell it. And guess what? We're making money. And we're selling to both sides. As we remain neutral, we're actually the winners here because we are benefiting from it. But Germany realizes we're not really neutral. And as our ships go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, Germany realizes this is how the war is going on and on and on, because Britain is still getting supplies from us. So they start figuring out what they can do about that. And so we're going to have some problems from that pretty soon. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I always want you to be thinking about what these things can cause, what can be coming up next. And they're encouraging the United States to get involved. So what I'm going to end with today is that Wilson won the election of 1916 by actually saying he kept us out of war. So these were some buttons that peace in America, war in Europe. God bless Wilson. He kept us out of war. But almost as soon as he wins that next election, things escalate so much and get to the point where he doesn't have a choice. And so he has to enter us into the war at that point. But he wins 1916 by saying he kept us out of war because he has been doing everything in his power. Imagine, there's lots of people at the United States. One of the things I said was encourage us to get involved. There are a lot of people that are trying to get the United States to get involved in the war and saying, why aren't we doing anything? We need to fight. We need to go over there. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so you've got everyone. I can't imagine being a president and having everybody's voice in my ear and trying to convince me one way or the other. Okay, for your comment, I want you to come up with a good slogan for a poster that could have been up at war trying to get someone to serve. So what could you say? What would be your phrase? And it can't be super long. I'm not talking about a paragraph. I'm talking about like one sentence or a phrase. What would you say to try to get someone to volunteer to serve? And your poster doesn't have to be to soldiers. It can be to anyone. It can be trying to encourage women to support like we saw at the beginning. It can be encouraging anybody to get involved. But what is your slogan to try to get the people involved? I hope you're enjoying this. I am. I hope you're maybe doing some research of your own. Go to the World War I museum website. It's fabulous. There's all kinds of things there. Just explore and learn new things.